Okay, thanks for coming everyone to the NPA seminar this week. This week we have Knospe, who will talk to us about light and heavy hadrons as probes of ion-ion collisions. Anders got his PhD actually here at Yale in 2011, some of you already heard, and then until 2020 he was stationed at CERN as a postdoc for UT Austin and then University of Houston. He started at Lehigh in the fall of 2020 as assistant professor there. And yeah, he's on STAR, Elise, and S-Phoenix, and I'll let him take it away now. So go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. And yeah, thank you all for inviting me to come back. So yeah, I've given you the very broad topic of using light and heavy hadrons as probes of ion-ion collisions. Okay, so just kind of a brief outline of what I want to talk about today. So I want to talk about, okay, so what can we learn by looking at using hadrons to look at ion collisions? Then I also just want to go through how do we actually measure the particles, because I know we have a few younger students here, so it might be good to just go through some, very quickly go through the basics of how we actually measure these things. And then the bulk of the presentation will be just a selection of interesting results. So a disclaimer, this is my own personal biased and incomplete compilation. So apologies if I don't get to your favorite results. But you know, this is a broad field. There are a lot of interesting things to talk about. So hopefully you'll also agree that what I'm showing you today is interesting. Okay, so if we want to use hadrons to study collisions, or if we want to study hadrons, what can we actually learn? So the first thing, and kind of the big thing for people who traditionally do heavy ion physics, is to study the properties of the system. So study the matter that we create in these collisions. So the properties of the QGP, we can also study the properties of the hadronic phase. We can study cold nuclear matter by looking at these very asymmetric collisions. And we also want to search for QGP-like effects in small systems. And then we want to know how those properties depend on the energy, the centrality, the multiplicity, and the geometry of the collision. But beyond studying basically the strong interaction and looking at these aspects of the strong interaction, we can also just use the colliders essentially as hadron factories and actually learn interesting things about the structures or about the properties of the hadrons. So we can learn some basic properties. So what are their masses, widths, quark contents, and branching ratios? One thing I'm not going to show you today is something that I'm working on Alice. So there was a particle discovered a few years ago by the Bell collaboration, an excited omega baryon. We also see it at Alice, so I'm looking to confirm that discovery and just measure some of the basic properties of that particle. We can also try to find out how do different types of hadrons interact with each other, what are their interaction cross-sections, and try to get into how the different types of hadrons are formed. So here's one result from Alice, which is the study of a heavy hypernucleus or a light hypernucleus, which I'll talk to you all about a bit later. So yeah, there are a lot of different things we can learn by looking at hadrons that are produced in these types of collisions. So how do we actually do these measurements? How do we actually measure these hadrons? So there are, you know, the measurement strategy is going to depend on what type of particle we're actually going to try to measure. So if we're talking about measurements of long-lived particles, we can frequently measure those directly. So charged particles, charged ions, charged kaons, protons, antiprotons, electrons, muons, those you know, live long. They show up directly in our tracking detectors. We can also measure electrons, positrons, and photons in our electromagnetic calorimeters. We can see hadrons in our hadronic calorimeters. We have dedicated muon detectors that sit outside some absorber, so we can get a signal. We're pretty sure it's a muon if it passes all the way through the absorber. And we also have other detectors like time of flight detectors, Cherenkov detectors, transition radiation detectors that help us identify what the long-lived particles are. So if we have these long-lived particles, particularly charged long-lived particles, we have many techniques for measuring that. But those aren't the only things that we actually want to measure. We also want to measure short-lived particles. So to measure short-lived particles, what we often do is an invariant mass analysis. So in that case, we will identify and measure the momenta of the decay products. So I'll use here as an example the decay of the phi meson, SS bar, to a K minus K plus pair. So we identify and measure the momenta of our decay products. We don't directly observe this thing. Then we add the four momentum vectors together to get the four momentum vector of the particle that decayed. Then it's just special relativity. We find the invariant mass of that decaying particle. So now this winds up being a combinatorial process. So if we have one collision with a bunch of K minuses and a bunch of K pluses, we do this exercise for all possible combinations of K pluses and K minuses. And eventually we can build up a histogram that has some peak corresponding to the actual signal of the particle sitting on top of some combinatorial background. So we do this many times, we build up and we can build up a histogram. Now, kind of more recent thing that's been done is actually using machine learning to be able to enhance the signals. You wouldn't need machine learning to find the phi. That's a fairly common particle, but machine learning to enhance the signals of some other rarer particles, which actually seems to be very promising. So yeah, this invariant mass technique is actually used to try to study a wide variety of these shorter lived particles that you can't observe directly, but instead you observe their decay products. So you can use this basic approach and do some expansions on it. So in the simplest simple decays like the phi, this basically just looks like a K minus and a K plus coming directly from the collision vertex. But if you're dealing with weak decays, you can actually have some more complicated decay topologies involving displaced vertices. So some of the common ones that we can look at are the V0 decay topology, where you have some neutral particle going to two oppositely charged particles, so making your V there. You can have a cascade, which is where you have this V0 topology, and then that projects back and gets matched with another charged particle, which can then go back via a charged particle to the primary collision. So that's the cascade. You can have this, what's called the kink topology, where it's basically a variation of the invariant mass analysis. So you actually measure the momenta of the decaying particle and one of its decay products, and then you have some neutral invisible particle that you don't actually measure. So then basically, you know this momentum, you know this momentum, so you can deduce the momentum of this. And then if you make assumptions about the identities of these two particles, you can figure out what the mass of this particle is. So it's just a way of slightly turning around the invariant mass analysis. And then you can have some other interesting decays, basically this Y-shaped decay or a V+1 or something, where you have, for example, a singly charged hypertriton decaying to a doubly charged helion and a pi minus. So there, if you actually measure the tracks for all of those, you can get some sort of Y-shaped decay. And then when you have decays like this, you can actually, there are some additional variables you can use. So depending on how close do these tracks come to each other, if you add their momentum together, does the result actually project back towards where it should go? You can measure on the lifetime that's implied by this distance. So there are some additional topological cuts that you can apply in order to reconstruct some of these shorter lived particles that you can't necessarily directly reconstruct in the tracking detectors. Okay, so with that very brief introduction to how we do this experimentally, now I want to get into the selection of results. I've tried to divide this into a couple different sections. So I'll start off talking about the hadron chemistry of the system that we create in these collisions, very broadly defined. So one very basic thing we can do is actually look at thermal models. So these are models basically allow us to predict the yields of many different types of particle species using just a few tunable parameters. So we have a temperature, a chemical potential. Sometimes we'll also need some mechanisms to suppress the production of strangeness. So either a gamma S strangeness suppression factor or some sort of correlation radius. But usually with just a few tunable parameters, we can actually get predictions for the yields of many different particles over many orders of magnitude of yields. We can have non-strange particles, strange particles, baryons, mesons, even light nuclei that all get predicted by these very simple models, which is actually pretty neat once you think about it. Just a few parameters, we can describe all these particles. Now, one thing that you might notice if you're looking closely is that short-lived resonances like the lambda star or the K star, they do tend to deviate from the predictions of the thermal model, but we actually have a pretty good understanding of why that happens, which I'll talk about a bit later. And we find that these models can work from pretty low energies. So here we have Hades and star all the way up to high energies. So here's an Alice measurement, or Alice measurements tested against a thermal model, where again, we have very good agreement for many different particles over a very broad, over many orders of magnitude. And here we're even getting some nuclei and anti-nuclei. So yeah, these thermal models are quite useful. And again, just with a few simple parameters, we can actually describe the yields of many different particles. But it's actually some of the deviations, like for those short-lived resonances, that can actually let us find some new interesting information. Here's one of my favorite Alice results. I actually contributed some of the results in this range. But this is a big compilation plot. One of the things that the Alice light flavor group really likes to show, because it shows a lot of work and shows some interesting effects. So basically, this shows us the yields of various types of particles. So going from protons, kaons, down to omegas with 3 units of strangeness. So the yields of these different types of particles normalize to the yields of pions as a function of the system size. So we have very large collisions over here, head-on nucleus-nucleus collisions, and very low multiplicity proton-proton collisions over here. And what we see is that we see this enhancement in the production of strange particles, strangeness enhancement, which was long predicted to be one of the signatures of the QGP. And we see that the magnitude of that strangeness enhancement actually increases with the strangeness content of the particle. So there's some strangeness enhancement when we look at lambda or psi, but then a lot more when we look at the triply strange particle, the omega. And another thing we observe here is that we see a smooth evolution of the particle production with the charged particle multiplicity, all the way from proton-proton collisions through proton-lead, xenon-xenon, lead-lead collisions. And we don't actually see any energy dependence in these ratios either. So it really seems like the hadron chemistry is being driven by the multiplicity, which is just a proxy for the system size. So in some sense, a peripheral nucleus-nucleus collision looks a lot like a high multiplicity proton-proton collision, which raises the question: are there similar underlying dynamics, similar processes that are happening in those two collision systems, which would seem to be very different at first look. So we can also use these particle ratios to figure out the properties of the medium that we're creating, or figure out the properties of the system that we're creating. So this is now going from LHC, which is what I was showing you before, to RHIC beam energy scan data. So going down to much lower energies, where we've measured, STARS just measured the ratios of common particles and antiparticles. So pi minus over pi plus, k minus over k plus, antiproton over proton. So some common ratios as a function of the collision energy. And we can see that none of these are flat, although in all cases they approach 1 as we go to the highest energies, but we actually get deviations from 1 as we're looking at the lower energies. So why does that actually happen? So if we're looking at the pi minus over pi plus ratio, we actually see this increase in the pi minus over pi plus ratio as we go down to the lower collision energies. And that's actually because in these nucleus-nucleus collisions, we're colliding gold on gold. So we have an excess of neutrons, which means we have an excess of down quarks, which means we're going to be more able to produce delta minus and delta zero baryons, and those things like to decay to pi minuses. So we have kind of preferential production of pi minuses via this mechanism, and that's why we get this enhancement at this low energy. Similarly, if we're looking at the k minus over k plus ratio, we see this downward deviation as we go down to lower energy. That's because when we're looking at these lower energy collisions, we have an excess of baryons. So basically, any S quarks that appear in the system, they're going to be produced in pairs, but any S quarks that appear in the system can get sucked up into a lambda baryon, and then you'll have some leftover S bar antiquarks, which can show up preferentially in K plus. So that gives you kind of an enhancement of the K plus production at these low energies, and gives you that shape for this ratio. And then if we look at the antiproton over proton ratio at low root S, we also see this deviation. This is just the participant baryons in our collision being slowed to mid rapidity. And we can actually use this ratio to try to learn about, for example, the baryon chemical potential of our system. So just continuing with some star beam energy scan data. So this upper plot actually shows a simultaneous blast wave fit, just using a Boltzmann-Gibbs blast wave function of the pion, kaon, and antiproton spectra, the yields of which I showed you before. And that can actually let us extract 2 parameters: the kinetic freeze-out temperature and the expansion velocity of the system. And we can do that in many different collisions. So what we see is that these properties do depend on the centrality of the collision. So we tend to get lower kinetic freeze-out temperature, higher expansion velocity in the very central collisions, as opposed to more peripheral collisions. But interestingly, they all basically seem to overlap on this trend. So for the RHIC beam energy scan from 7.7 all the way up to 200 GeV, everything basically lies along the same curve. So that can kind of suggest maybe that we're having some similar dynamics, and really we're just reaching maybe a slightly different, slightly different, more expanding QGP out here. But otherwise, the energy isn't really that important as far as the properties of the thing that we're producing. We can also use thermos to fit the particle yields, again, that I showed on the previous slide. And we can use that to extract the chemical freeze-out temperature and some other properties. So in this fit for 27 GeV data, STAR extracted a chemical freeze-out temperature of about 160 MeV. There's some weak centrality dependence in there. And we find that this temperature that we get for the chemical freeze-out is above, but fairly close to the kinetic freeze-out temperature that we get from doing these blast wave fits. So it seems like whatever hadronic phase would exist between the chemical freeze-out and the kinetic freeze-out, might not last a whole long time. Again, depending on energy and what system we're looking at. Also from these thermos fits, we can extract a few other parameters. So we can find the baryon chemical potential, at least in central gold-gold collisions at this energy. That seems to be about 140 MeV. And this ties again back into the proton or the antiproton to the proton ratio. And interestingly, this baryon chemical potential is not observed to be constant with rapidity. So depending on which rapidity range you look at, you can actually get kind of a spread of about 25 MeV in the baryon chemical potential. And then we can also find a non-zero strangeness chemical potential of around 35 MeV for these central collisions at this energy. So just by measuring a few of these particle yields, we can actually determine some interesting things about the system's properties and actually place it on the phase diagram of QCD. So we can figure out what mu B is, we can figure out what the chemical freeze-out is. But we can actually go beyond that. So kind of well, maybe not the easiest way, but the kind of the standard way we've measured the enhancement of strangeness, coming back to strangeness enhancement, the standard way we've measured that is to do that nice Alice plot and look at the ratios of yields of various particles. But we can actually go further in depth than that, and we can actually start to see some even more interesting effects. So one strategy that Alice has recently started deploying is to really look on an event by event basis. How many of each type of strange particle do we produce? So how many K0 shorts do we produce per event, et cetera? And you can actually, you can basically calculate the probability to produce N of each species. So how often do we produce 1 K short an event versus how often do we produce 7 of them? You can do the same thing for lambdas and psis and omegas. So you calculate the probability for producing each species in a single event. And we actually find that the probability to produce very high N's tends to increase as we go from low multiplicity to high multiplicity proton-proton collisions. So this is again a manifestation of that strangeness enhancement and the multiplicity dependence of the strangeness enhancement that we observe in proton-proton collisions, and in particular the high multiplicity proton-proton collisions. So using these measurements of, okay, how often do we produce N strange particles of each species in an event, we can actually calculate the average production yield of N K0 shorts or N lambdas as a function of the charged particle multiplicity, which is shown for each of these plots here. And then we can, of course, compare these to models because we want to compare the models to help us kind of get a handle on the physics. So we can do that for these various particle species. And we find that, for example, EPOS and Pythia 8 at least qualitatively reproduce these increasing trends and even the change in slope more or less. Although we do find that EPOS LHC, at least at high multiplicity, and Pythia 8 with ropes actually does a better job at predicting the data that we observe, while if you turn off the ropes, you get not particularly good agreement for some of these things. And we find that the agreement between the data and the models gets worse as you increase N. So there's still some work to be done on this, but it actually gives us kind of a more detailed look at the strangeness enhancement and how it's really happening kind of on an event by event level. So another thing you can do is you can just use it using the yield ratios I showed on the previous slide. You can actually take the ratio of the S equals 1 baryon, so the lambda, divided by the S equals 1 meson, so the K0 short, and that will effectively let us disentangle some baryon-related effects from a strangeness-related effect. So we see that if we're just talking about the production of 1 lambda and 1 K0 short in an event, that ratio is pretty much flat. with the charged particle multiplicity. But we actually start to see an increase in this ratio as we start producing more of these particles in a given event. And that increase is actually pretty well reproduced by Pythia 8, including ropes, but if we turn off ropes, not very well reproduced. So that means that earlier plot of the ratios to pions, that could include both strangeness-related and baryon-related contributions, but doing this, where we're looking at this baryon to meson ratio, lets us get rid of the strangeness effect and just see what might be a baryon-related effect. And so it turns out that including the color ropes gives a good reproduction of this baryon-related effect, particularly in the high multiplicity region. So this is an interesting study where you can really do just a more detailed look at some more granular observables to try to get a better idea about how strangeness enhancement is actually happening in an event. So another thing I wanted to talk about, which is I guess related to strangeness enhancement, but it's mainly just an interesting measurement that Alice has been able to do, is getting various techniques of measuring the sigma baryons. So these are singly strange baryons, but we tend to measure them a lot less than the other singly strange baryon, which is the lambda, just because their reconstruction is a bit more complicated. It is more complicated because their decays usually involve stuff that's a bit harder to measure, like neutrons, pi zeros, or photons. Not impossible, just a bit harder. So we've typically studied the lambdas much more than the sigmas, but Alice is actually now able to reconstruct these and using a couple different interesting techniques. So in this measurement of the sigma plus and its antiparticle, they just reconstruct the proton in the tracking detector. So that's an easy part. And then the other participant is a pi zero, which you can reconstruct by looking for the photons. Pi zero goes to 2 photons, and then you can either find the photons in the calorimeters or look for photon conversions like up here. And you can actually reconstruct your pi zero and do your invariant mass analysis. And you can get this very nice sigma peak sitting on top of some interestingly shaped combinatorial background. So right now, these are fairly new measurements. So they're kind of being used as additional tests for event generators. But once this is fully integrated into our particle detection framework, we can actually do some interesting things with these sigmas and kind of add that to our collection of particles that we typically measure. Yeah. So then another interesting way Alice has measured the sigmas is to actually we can actually find this anti-neutron in the Fox calorimeter. So there'll be some signal in the Fox calorimeter that's not matched with a track. You can actually deduce the momentum of the particle based on its time of flight. So you can actually figure out the momentum of these two things and then build up again an invariant mass plot. And yet a third way of measuring the sigmas is coming back to this kink decay topology that I told you about, where we don't measure this thing, but we can measure this. And now with some good tracking in the center of the detector, we can actually get a good handle on what the momentum of the decaying particle is. So we can use the kink topology to also build up a very nice invariant mass distribution, in this case of the sigma plus in some antiparticles. So yeah, this we're still, I think, fully waiting to integrate this into the zoo of particles that Alice measures, but really promising 3 different techniques to measure these particles. So now I'd like to change gears slightly. We're still broadly talking about the hadron chemistry, but I want to talk about hadronic resonances for a second, because this is something that I spent both of my postdocs working on and I'm still working on a little bit as I wrap up some Alice projects. So looking at hadronic resonances is really a way to study the hadronic phase that is formed in these collisions after hadronization. So we can kind of look at the hadronic phase. So, we start out with the QGP over here. At some point, we make a phase transition into a hadron gas phase. Initially, we have a lot of interactions among those hadrons. You can change the abundances of different types of hadrons, but eventually you're going to reach what we call the chemical freeze out, at which point the yields of the long-lived hadrons are going to be fixed. Then we continue to have some evolution until the kinetic freeze out, at which point even the momenta are fixed. We're not even getting elastic interactions anymore. And then basically everything is fixed and we just get the particles that we observe at the detectors. But it turns out that you can still have interesting things happening to resonances between the chemical freeze out and the kinetic freeze out. So, for example, you can have elastic or pseudoelastic interactions between particles that are produced earlier in the system. So basically, you can have a pion and a kaon scatter through a K star even during this chemical freeze-out phase when basically the yields of all the other longer-lived particles have been fixed. And this regeneration process will result in an increase in the measured resonance yield. But you can also have kind of the opposite, or a different process, which is rescattering. So if you start off with a K star, and then it decays during this hadronic phase, but then one of its decay daughters undergoes some scattering in the hadron gas, then you basically smear out the invariant mass distribution that you would have measured for the K star. So you effectively will no longer measure this resonance. So this rescattering process reduces the measurable resonance yield. And then you can also have kind of a different version of rescattering, where rather than just some sort of random scattering here, you can actually have this pion being pseudoelastically scattered through a different resonance yield. So again, we wouldn't be able to really reconstruct this K star because that pion would have gone through a row and would have kind of gotten mixed up when it became one of these outgoing pions. So again, if we lose this pion, we can't reconstruct the initial particle. So both of these flavors of rescattering are going to tend to reduce the measurable resonance yield. So then the final resonance yield after kinetic freeze-out are going to depend on, okay, what was the chemical freeze-out temperature, what was the lifetime of the hadronic phase, what was the lifetime of the resonance, and then also the scattering cross-sections for its various decay products. So by measuring the abundances of various resonances, we can actually try to get a handle on what some of these properties are. So two common particles that we look at are the K star and the phi. They're fairly easy to reconstruct. And what we observe, so here's a plot of various particle ratios. So either the K star to K ratio or the phi to K ratio as a function of the system size. And we find very different behavior for these two resonances. For the K star, we see this suppression trend. The yield of K star tends to get reduced as we go from lower multiplicity proton-proton collisions up to the most central nucleus-nucleus collisions. So, we can actually compare to thermal model predictions here, and we find that in central nucleus-nucleus collisions, the K star yield is significantly below the thermal model prediction, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. So this trend actually suggests that rescattering is dominant over regeneration for this K star. In contrast, we see a very different behavior for the phi. The phi isn't suppressed. There's even actually a little bit of enhancement, which seems to be tied to strangeness enhancement. And it is actually generally consistent with statistical models. And the salient difference here is that the lifetime of the phi is about 10 times longer than the lifetime of the K star. So in the end, the rescattering effects wind up not being significant for the phi. Many of them, they can live long enough that their decay daughters are not really going to be affected by that rescattering effect. So we see these two very different behaviors for these two different resonances, and that's tied to their different lifetimes. We can also do a comparison of these results to theory. Maybe I'll go a bit quickly through this, but we see that both EPOS and PHSD are able to decently reproduce the trend and also SMASH, which I didn't show here. Also, there's a pretty good reproduction of the trend. But at least for EPOS, the trend is much better described when we turn rescattering on. Because EPOS, we can actually turn off the rescattering portion, and then you get this trend where, okay, there's a little bit of suppression, but not nearly as much. So in EPOS, we really do need to turn on the rescattering process in order to get that suppression trend. It's also interesting to go back to the same plot, which just really look at the small collision systems. Because we can see that, okay, we should take our uncertainty seriously, but we do see a hint or a possible hint of this decreasing trend of this rescattering effect if we look at high multiplicity proton-proton or proton-lead collisions, which, if true, could be a hint of a hadronic phase with some non-zero lifetime, even in these small collision systems. Another thing I like to point out here is that we have these smooth transitions again between the different collision systems, proton-proton, proton-lead, all the way up into lead-lead as a function of the multiplicity. So it seems like just like the yields of the other hadrons I talked about, the resonance yields are also mainly controlled by the system size. So I talked about the phi and the K star, but there are also other resonances that Alice and Starr have measured that are interesting to talk about here. So I'm going to build up this plot gradually. So basically, I'm putting the shortest lived resonances up here at the top and the longest lived resonances down here at the bottom. So we've already talked about the K star, which has this suppression trend. and the phi, which doesn't have a suppression trend. So let's try to put some other resonances onto this plot. And this is another one of my favorite plots because I contributed a lot and actually made the version that I'm showing you. So yeah, let's start adding some particles. So first we can add the row 0, which is kind of the shortest lived particles that Alice typically studies. So it decays to 2 pions. We can do this kind of complicated reconstruction of the row 0. It's a broad resonance, so it can kind of overlap with some other things. But what we find is we also see this suppression trend for the row 0 in central nucleus-nucleus collisions with respect to the smaller collision systems. And again, it's qualitatively fairly well reproduced by EPOS if you include the rescattering effect. And again, we see this apparent downward trend in the proton-lead collisions, which might be a hint of rescattering, but our uncertainties are large enough that we don't want to make too strong a statement about that. So we have these 2 short-lived resonances that both seem to exhibit this rescattering effect, while this longer-lived resonance doesn't exhibit that effect. We can also look at another short-lived resonance, which is the lambda 1520. So those results are shown here. Again, we see the suppression trend, this decrease as we go to the larger collision systems. And again, we don't really see any energy dependence in this ratio as we go from RHIC to the LHC. And again, this trend is qualitatively somewhat described by EPOS, although I do wish the agreement had been better there. And there are also some other mechanisms that can also describe this kind of general trend of decrease. So we have these 3 fairly short-lived resonances that all exhibit this suppression effect. So, okay, now let's look at kind of an intermediate lifetime resonance. So the psi star is kind of intermediate between this lambda 1520, which does show the suppression, and the phi, which doesn't show the suppression. So in this case, uncertainties are unfortunately large. It is a bit ambiguous, but it seems like there's at least within the lead-lead collisions, there's no significant centrality dependence in this psi star over psi ratio. And that at least that flatness is qualitatively described both by EPOS and share 3. But we do see that the results out here in nucleus-nucleus collisions do seem to be systematically lower than the results in smaller collision systems. So maybe this is telling us there's some weak suppression of this kind of intermediate lifetime resonance. Ideally, we could get some measurements with smaller uncertainties here to try to figure out exactly what's going on. And then if we look in proton-proton and proton-lead, we don't really see any clear multiplicity dependence here. So this is an intermediate lifetime resonance. It may have some rescattering, but it's a little bit hard to tell. And then we can also go back and look at another short lifetime resonance where we start to see some interesting things happening. So this sigma star is comparable in lifetime to the K star. The K star did show this rescattering effect. But actually, if we look at sigma star, this is unfortunately, measurements of this have been a bit harder. But we actually, we don't see significant evidence of suppression if we look at gold-gold collisions at star. But there are some indications that I'll show you on the next slide that there may be a little bit of a suppression effect. But if we just look at the EPOS prediction, we find that there's no suppression predicted for this ratio by EPOS. That's even though this resonance has a short lifetime. So actually, the lifetime is not the only consideration when we look at these ratios and whether there should be suppression or not. We also need to consider other things like scattering cross sections and things like that. So just staying on the sigma star for a moment. So here's actually this is a ratio not of sigma star over lambda, which would have been nice, but sigma star over pions, and we can see that. So this ratio is below the thermal model prediction for central lead-lead collisions, which would imply rescattering. But in lead-lead collisions, which are these 3 points here, there's only really a weak centrality dependence. It's not really clear just looking within lead-lead if there's much centrality dependence here. But this is also kind of because we're looking at sigma star compared to pions. This could also, there could be a strangeness enhancement effect involved in here. So looking at this ratio, actually, we're kind of looking at 2 possibly competing effects, which makes it a bit harder. So basically, the reason I haven't shown you the sigma star over lambda ratio is that the lambdas aren't out yet. So we want to, there's something I can't show you quite at the moment, but hopefully we'll get there. Okay, so just want to move on for a second and talk about away from resonances again and talk about hadronization. So how do we actually model the hadronization process? So in the study I'm about to show you, it's comparing 2 different approaches. So there's the Lund string fragmentation approach, where the conservation laws are applied very locally, basically at each individual string breaking. And that means you'll wind up having, you'll have strong correlations only between particles with opposite sign quantum numbers. Somewhat in contrast is the canonical statistical hadronization approach, where you still apply the conservation laws, but they're applied less locally over some finite correlation volume. And in that case, it turns out correlations between the particles, you can have correlations between particles with same or opposite sign quantum numbers. So Alice has actually done a nice study of this by measuring, again, the event by event production of psi baryons and kaons, and then using some complicated cumulants of the event by event production to try to distinguish between these two different approaches. So here's the result of the study. So you don't need to worry about exactly what this is, but basically this rho variable on the vertical axis just quantifies how much of a correlation is there in the production of the psi baryon and the kaon. And in this case, a negative value means that there's an anti-correlation between the production of those two types of particles. So an interesting feature here is that there's pretty good continuity across the different collision systems, proton-proton, proton-lead, lead-lead. And then if you compare the various model predictions shown on here, basically the string fragmentation approach, which is everything except the orange line. So those are implemented with Pythia with Agnentier or with Hijing. Those pretty much fail to reproduce this measurement of this cumulant. But it turns out, although if you do turn on color ropes, it does help describe a bit. So this line shows color ropes. It's getting a bit closer to what Alice actually measures. But actually the much better description is given by the canonical statistical model approach implemented with FIST, which gives a very good agreement with the measured trend with a correlation volume of about 3 times dVdy. You can do a measurement in the same study of a different cumulant, so the normalized second cumulant for the psi. This is sensitive only to correlations between particles that have opposite quantum numbers. And again, the Alice results here seem to be in much better agreement with the CSM approach, again, where the quantum numbers are conserved over a finite correlation volume. So you can actually use those studies to say, okay, here are the Alice results for lead collisions. So let's try throwing in different correlation volumes, and let's try to find the optimal correlation volume. And in fact, if when Alice did that, they found this optimal correlation volume of around 3 dVdy. And just note so that if you actually were to go down to a 0 correlation volume, value of 0 for this ratio, that's going to correspond to an infinite correlation volume. So that's the grand canonical limit. But yeah, so basically you can use these measurements to kind of get a handle on, okay, what should we actually be using as the correlation volume when we're doing these models? Okay, so yeah, I talked a lot about kind of the hadron chemistry. I want to talk briefly about nuclei, and in particular anti-nuclei and hypernuclei, because there's been a lot of interesting developments in studies of those objects recently. So one interesting thing is measuring the cross-section for the annihilation of anti-nuclei in matter. So until recently, the inelastic cross-sections for anti-nuclei to annihilate a normal matter were not really well known, particularly at low momentum. And if we, the reason we care about this is actually because we need very precise knowledge of these cross-sections if we're going to predict, if we're going to understand the background for astrophysical searches in dark matter. Because if you have annihilation, that can give you a signal that could look like a dark matter candidate. So we really need to know how often the anti-nuclei that are produced in the galaxy are going to annihilate near our detectors. But of course, we can't just make beams of anti-nuclei. That's not a trivial thing. So we basically are using the LHC as an anti-nucleus factory. And then we're using the Alice detector as a target for those anti-nuclei. So we want to find out what is the cross-section for them to annihilate in the target, which is the Alice detector. So yeah, using the Alice detector as a target for these studies. So there are actually 2 different methods for doing this. The first is, so they measure the antimatter over matter ratio, and then they find also the antimatter over matter ratio from antiproton over proton measurements. And then that basically, so they find that ratio from antiproton over proton measurements. Then they measure the yield of anti-nuclei over nuclei. And then that basically tells them, okay, how likely are the antinuclei to be lost in this process? So how different is the antinucleus over nucleus ratio in comparison to the antiproton over proton ratio, which we can measure? So that's one approach. The other approach is to actually measure the antinucleus yield separately using just the TPC, and then also measuring how many of those antinuclei actually make it all the way out to the time of flight detector, which surrounds the TPC. So basically that tells us how many antinuclei get lost in the material that sits between the TPC and the top. And there is some material in there, which can cause the loss of antinuclei. So basically, using these two methods, I can actually figure out the cross sections for these antinuclei to interact with some average material inside Alice, and can actually measure these inelastic cross sections both for antideuterons up here and for some antihelium and antitritons up here. So yeah, that's one interesting study. Another interesting thing that's been done is looking at now A=4 hypernuclei. So a hypernucleus is just a nucleus where usually one of the neutrons has been replaced with a lambda, although you can also put other baryons in there in principle. Alice has reconstructed these A=4 hypernuclei. So the hyperhydrogen 4, which is a proton, neutron, neutron, lambda bound state, and looked at how it decays to an alpha particle and a pi minus. And also hyperhelium 4 and how it has this 3-body decay. So you can identify all of these decay products by looking at the energy loss, in the time projection chamber, and you can get signals for helium-3 and even helium-4 out there, and of course the antiparticles over here. And then you can actually use topological selections and some machine learning to enhance the signal and try to get a measurement of your antinuclei. So STAR is also working on a paper that shows that studies the A=4 hypernuclei. No results I'm going to show right now, but hopefully that paper will be out very soon. And then maybe I'll just skip over that result for time. But then we can also study the hypertriton. So that's a proton, neutron, lambda bound state, which decays to a helion and a pi minus. Again, you can use TPC energy loss to identify the decay products, then use machine learning to enhance your signal throughout the background. And then you can actually measure the hypertriton yield in different CT bins. So measure the yield as a function of CT, and that actually lets you do an exponential fit and extract the lifetime of the hypertriton, because that's actually been something interesting to try to nail down on the experimental side. And you can also measure the lambda separation energy of the hypertriton if you have very precise knowledge of the masses of the particles and very good energy measurement. So Alice actually has the most precise measurements of the hypertriton lifetime and the lambda separation energy. And taken together, they imply that the hypertriton is a loosely bound state of a proton, a neutron, and a lambda that has a lifetime very close to the lifetime of the 3 lambda. So these whisker plots show the Alice result down here, by far the most precise measurement, and then some earlier measurements of this lifetime and this lambda separation energy with larger uncertainties. But Alice is really kind of at the frontier at this point. So actually measuring these properties could help us understand the interactions between hyperons and nucleons, and that has implications for understanding the equation of state in neutron stars, which is the so-called hyperon puzzle. Another interesting thing to look at is the interactions between hyperons and nucleons. That ties back into learning about the equation of state inside neutron stars. So basically what the experiments do, STAR in this case, is to measure the correlation function, this C of K star, of a pair of particles as a function of this K star variable, which is just the particle momentum in the pair rest frame. So basically, if there's kind of a deviation above 1 of this ratio above 1 can usually indicates an attractive potential. So STAR observes an attractive potential both for protons and lambdas and also deuterons on lambdas, which I don't show here. So then you can use this measured correlation function to actually extract the size of the source that's emitting this pair of protons and lambdas or deuterons and lambdas using this spherical Gaussian source model. And you can actually, so that's what this result in the lower right-hand side shows, the source model that STAR was able to extract as a function of centrality. So you see the source size gets larger for the more central collisions. And also the source size for the emission of protons and lambdas seems to be a bit larger than the source size for the emissions of deuterons and lambdas. Okay, I guess I don't know how much time I have left, but should I keep going or should I stop?
So about 5 minutes.
Okay, we'll go 5 more minutes. We'll get through some flow and vorticity and I guess no Porconia today. So yeah, I also wanted to just talk about some interesting flow and vorticity results that came out recently. So STAR has done this nice measurement of flow during the beam energy scan. So basically we see that so V2, the variable that quantifies the elliptic flow or the SVF anisotropy, that actually changes sign as you change the collision energy from 3 GeV up to 4 GeV. So at the lowest energies, V2 is actually less than 0. This is due to what's called the spectator shadowing effect, where the nucleons that don't participate really in the interaction are kind of shadowing particles that are trying to move outward. While at higher energies, we transition to a V2 greater than 0, which would seem to be an indication of the onset of flow. So we observe this sign change for various species, both strange and non-strange baryons and mesons. And then if you do JAM2 calculations to try to predict what the magnitude and sign of V2 should be, only the calculation with the mean field with spectator shadowing is able to actually get a sign change in V2, so at least qualitatively reproduce the results that we're seeing, although the actual magnitude is not particularly well reproduced. So another thing that's interesting is to look at number of constituent quark scaling as a function, look at number of constituent quark scaling for different energies. We find that NCQ scaling holds pretty nicely for square root of S of 14.6 GeV, and for higher energies. Now the scaling isn't perfect, but it does hold within about 20%, something like that. But there's a very big difference when you go down to the lower energies. NCQ scaling seems to break down completely as we get down around 3.2 GeV. These V2 values don't even really have the same sign as we start to look at these very low energies for different species. So that kind of suggests that we're seeing the disappearance of partonic collectivity as we go down to these lower collision energies. So have we actually reached the lower limit of the energies at which we're producing QGP? Oops. I'll just skip over these and come to a last thing that I think is interesting, and then we can wrap up. And that was actually using this flow to try to figure out, okay, what is the F0980? So you might not know what the F0980 is anyway, but it's a meson, it's flavor neutral, but there are actually different hypotheses for what its quark content might actually be. So it could just be a normal meson, either an SS bar pair or some light QQ bar pair. It could be a hybrid meson where you have a QQ bar pair, but then you basically have a permanent gluon in order to make a color singlet. It could be a tetraquark, so a QQ bar, SS bar, and those could either just kind of be bound up in one big blob, or you could actually have separation of the two into a kaon anti-kaon molecule like this. So there are these different hypotheses. So the approach that CMS took is to actually measure the V2 of this F0980. So look at the SVF anisotropy and do the NCQ scaling, because the NQ, the denominator in your ratio, is going to be different depending on which of these models for the quark content of the F0 you're actually looking at. So when they do that, they have so if they assume that NQ equals 2, they get their scaled V2 for the F0, basically following the trend with some other with other particles. While if they assume NQ equals 4, which would be the tetraquark or the kaon molecule hypothesis, they actually get a V2 that doesn't agree with the other particles. So this result suggests that the NQ equals 2 hypothesis agrees much better than either NQ equals 4, which is tetraquark, or the NQ equals 3, which is the hybrid approach. And actually, they can also do a fit to determine the optimal NQ, which is nicely consistent with 2. So basically, CMS has concluded that the F0 is a normal SS bar meson. But there's actually one more thing we can do to try to figure out what its quark content is. So this comes from the ALICE collaboration. So ALICE measures the F0980 in these smaller collision systems. So here we have a measurement in the proton-proton collisions. Here we have a measurement in proton-lead collisions. And then ALICE compares the yield ratios, so F0 over pi or F0 over K star normalized to low multiplicity, and compares those yield ratios to model predictions while making different assumptions about whether it is a QQ bar meson or an SS bar meson. So when they do that, they find that generally the results are better described by the absolute or the absolute value of strangeness equals 0 assumption, so the QQ bar assumption. So basically, the Alice results suggest that this would tend to be more of a QQ bar meson and less of an SS bar meson. So basically, combining these Alice and CMS results, there seems to be an indication that this is the quark content of the F09A. Okay, so maybe I will just skip through the other results that I was going to show you. And I'll just conclude by saying that, yeah, as heavy ion physicists, we can do a lot of interesting studies using hadrons, both to probe our collisions and also just to try to learn about the properties of the hadrons themselves. Looking ahead, I'm particularly excited to use quarkonia, which I didn't wasn't even able to get to during this lecture, but to look for quarkonia in S-Phoenix data. My group is also working on some quarkonium analyses in STAR. So I'd just like to say thank you for welcoming me back. So this is a picture of me in my regalia, but not when I graduated. This is actually the first time I've worn my regalia since graduation. They sat in my storage unit for 11 years. And then I finally got them out for our convocation at Lehigh. So my first time wearing my regalia as a professor, and they're a little bit wrinkled, which I'll have to fix for graduation. Yeah, so thank you for having me back, and yeah, I'm open for questions.
So actually, this was a very impressive talk on these things. I do have a question about quarkonia, but first, can we go to slide 15? And I guess it does have to do with this quarkonia question.
Start asking, and I'll get
yeah, so I guess like in this plot that you have here, there isn't anything, so maybe it's actually 17, sorry, but it is around for this event by event, sort of like probability density functions that you're building. Because I saw these results at quark matter, and then I hadn't seen anything for the cascades, which you did show, which is very impressive. Is there anything like this analysis done for the phi meson?
I would really like to see that, because we had these results.
Yeah, exactly.
They also have them for the psi and the omega, but not for the phi, and I think that would be interesting. So yeah, if I were, I'm kind of wrapping up my involvement in that part of Alice, unfortunately, but yeah, I would really like to see that for phi. I know there is a study of like double phi production that's kind of a bit different from this. I don't know if kind of a result like this could be taken from that. Yeah, that was one thing that I considered including, then didn't. So there is some study of that, but it's done a bit differently.
Okay. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, I'm actually gonna switch over to the resonance production. We have this plot of the resonance as a function of, I guess, the charged particle multiplicity density, and they're all divided by so this one. Is there any analysis at least that you're aware of for the omega meson?
So there are some. We haven't typically added them to this plot. I'm forgetting exactly the reasons. But yeah, there are some. I should probably be able to say more about it than that.
So the reason why I'm asking is because this little meson kind of makes me think, because we tend to think of it as kind of like a pionic resonance, but there is a tiny contribution in the actual, I guess, the scattering angle for the Clark-Corbin coefficient, whatever, in which there is an SS bar pair contribution that is usually negligible. So people tend to see it as a basically non-strange object. So I was just curious, maybe if you have heard anything about any crazy ideas of looking at this meson as actually having some type of strangeness to it.
I think like ideally, I think actually the problem is more experimental now that I'm remembering. I'm forgetting off the top of my head what the decay modes are, but I think it's a bit more difficult to reconstruct, which I think is probably the reason that we haven't included it in a study like this. But yeah, ideally, if we had more person power and the facility to really do a comprehensive set of omega meson measurements, then yeah, I think we can include it in something like this, and also in that, like in the strangeness enhancement.
Sure.
Because yeah, looking, we want to look at as many particles as we can to really get a good handle on these effects.
Right.
Actually, while we're already on this slide, I was going to ask a question here. And can you go into a little bit more detail about why we see this kind of different trend for the sigma star than the others that we see, where somehow lifetime isn't quite as important for this particular?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the model predictions on here are actually, so these are EPOS predictions. That's from a paper I wrote with Christina Marker and Klaus Werner. Yeah, like it's a bit difficult to say. And I think we were hoping to have, experimental results that we could compare to sooner. But yeah, it really seems to be the case that it's not just the lifetime. There are other things that need to be considered. And I think one thing we've identified is, yeah, the scattering cross sections of the particles that this star decays to are apparently different enough that either we don't get rescattering or we get a lot of regeneration that would kind of balance that out and give us this sort of trend. But yeah, it is an interesting question. I don't feel like we have a really firm understanding of why, but yeah, we have the prediction coming out of the model, and we'd like to be able to compare it to some experimental results.
Okay. Thanks.
You go back to, I think it's slide 25, but go slowly and I'll stop you when you get there.
Okay,
No, okay.
keep going.
It was where you were talking about the mainstream model versus the one with the volume.
Okay, that was, no, that was later. After the resonances.
Yeah, okay, I just forgot what it was called, the canonical statistical hadronization. So it's a couple slides forward. That one seems to describe these resonances more. But in general, I guess I get the feeling that a lot of people really believe in the Lund string model. So what are the things, are there things that the Lund string model gets that the canonical stationization model doesn't get? And if so, how do we reconcile that these two different quantum conservation approaches get different things?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think there are many things it gets right. So if I'm remembering correctly, like our strangeness enhancement can be pretty well described in many cases. I mean, maybe if we're not going to the multi-strange production that I showed before, but the ratio to pions, that I think comes pretty accurately out of models that do this. So yeah, I think things like that. I think also PT dependent ratios, if I'm remembering correctly, also tend to get that fairly well. So yeah, I think I mean, neither of them is perfect in describing this. So yeah, I think the real truth is probably more complicated than either of these approaches. So yeah, I don't know if that was a helpful answer to your question or not.
No.
Just my thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, I guess there's a thing like the Lundstrom model does well, but it doesn't do baryons well.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of, and I guess there's a baryon in this correlation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, turning on ropes helps, but yeah.
What is ropes?
Just strings. Huh? Yeah, it's like collections of strings. I honestly don't have a very good understanding of what it is. It's the magic knob they turn to make things happen. Yeah, it was like correlated strings, collections of strings interacting with. Yeah, it's a lot of strings together. Anyway, this is going on the internet.
What do you mean with topological machine learning?
Oh, let's see, was that this slide or remember for some of the earlier ones in the track? Oh, yeah, so I think kind of talking about the particle. These topologies or
No, it was much more.
I think when you talk about machine learning applied for the hypernuclei, is that what you're asking about?
okay, yeah, we can also do them for resonances. So, well, yeah, I'll flip through slowly, but basically, so yeah, with machine learning, I think so. Basically, you feed in the momenta of many particles. You can feed in some variables related that you derive from the momenta, although not the mass of the particle, because then you're just going to select on the signal that you want. But yeah, basically you can feed in these variables or feed in just kind of some basic information. The machine learning algorithm will figure out kind of in a more complicated way, what are the correlations between particles that are an indication of an actual object decaying into them rather than just random noise. So that's kind of the idea. So just kind of the shape of the decay. Machine learning seems to be good at picking out correlations that we wouldn't be able to get from a more traditional cut-based analysis. So that's kind of the idea behind it.
Yeah, but you mentioned topological, so what's the difference between the traditional machine learning algorithm?
Let me just make sure I'm finding the right.
Sorry, I don't remember the slide.
So yeah, so just going back to like the V zeros and the cascades I was showing before. So you don't necessarily need machine learning to do those, but you're basically cutting on the shape of the decay. So in addition to doing the momentum pairing, you're also cutting on how close the tracks approach to each other. Do they point back to where they should have originated from? So yeah, there are these additional variables that can give you a better idea of whether a pair is really something that is decaying or just some random combination of particles. Okay. So that's the general idea.
That's how you phrase that, right? I guess it's machine learning using variables that depend on the topology versus that it's a topology machine learning, as in sort of like a neural net. It's not a phrase of the machine learning, it's what we're sending it.
Yeah, I think it's more the variables that we're putting, if my understanding is correct.
That's what I think.
Because otherwise you misidentify the particles, right?
Yeah, you can misidentify.
The tracks are too small and.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be good at picking out these signals that would be much more difficult, like the hypernuclei, what I showed you that was done with machine learning. And there's a dramatic increase in the signal that we observe. We also want to do some of that with in the Sphinx forthcoming program at some point.
Can you say a bit more with this F-Meson that you talked about at the end? Like,
oh, yeah.
You identify experimentally, like what method it had? Like, can you do it inside jets?
Yeah, I think you could do it inside jets. So yeah, so basically it typically decays. It typically decays to charged pions. I guess the decay to K plus K minus is also seen. But yeah, so it's yeah, you can do it. You do it with an invariant mass analysis. Kind of like the row meson that I showed you earlier. It is also a bit of a broader resonance. I forget what the width is.
But you can reconstruct its momentum.
Yeah. So if you can measure the momenta of the decay products. So then when you do this invariant mass analysis, you also know the momentum of the pair that would have produced it. So yeah, you can get the momentum fairly easily. I think I didn't show it here, but yeah, Alice, there are actually some nice measurements of the momentum spectra of this particle. That Alice has done. So yeah, you can get the momentum reasonably easy.
That mass is fairly close to the phi mass, no?
Yeah, fairly close, and also close to the kaon.
Oh yeah,
for that threshold. But yeah, I think it, as I recall, it decays to KK much less than phi does, because you don't really see a contribution from it in phi peaks.
So briefly mentioned that you are interested in quark-gluon for Phoenix, right? So basically what I'm wondering is, probably I should know the answer, but I don't. Where does Phoenix have like an upper hand in sort of repeating the similar quark-gluon analysis?
Oh, so that I think I might have even included a plot of that as my almost last. Sorry, let me just pull this up because so basically S Phoenix will have very nice reconstruction of the three epsilon states. So that's really the bread and butter for S Phoenix. And actually, if you look at the logo of S Phoenix, there's a jet on one side and there's an epsilon pair basically on the other side. So yeah, this really nice invariant mass resolution is better than what Star has, although Star has gotten a lot out and they just published a really nice result in their epsilons recently. But yeah, S Phoenix will have significantly better invariant mass resolution, particularly for the epsilons, and similar in quality to a plot that you would see from CMS. So we can do kind of similar measurements to what CMS has done, but at RHIC energies.
Like for epsilon, you're right, but you can't do anything lower mass, right?
Well, in principle, but we're going to run with triggers. So yeah, effectively because it is kind of designed for doing epsilon. So even like low PDJ psi, there's a question about how low in PT we can actually go.
So basically, that's the only observation.
That'll be the most important one, but we can try to look at polarization. We can try to look at V2 of this. So we can look at higher momentum J psi's. and the Charmonia. So this is certainly, I think it's the most important measurement that S Phoenix will be doing in the quark-gluon sector. Not the only one, but yeah, it is definitely a big piece.
The 24 billion you have there doesn't seem like you can resolve the 3s state or operate. Third.
So here. Yeah, I guess if you're looking at this one, we would have the resolution, but I guess this would really just be showing the melting of the 3s. So yeah, no, that is a good point, which I hadn't quite noticed, because yeah, the 3s peak is actually kind of hard to see in there. But at least, so the predictions we have for being able to measure RAA of epsilon, it does seem to indicate that we can actually get into, having uncertainties that don't touch zero. So maybe this is for a smaller set. I'm now kind of forgetting the details of that.
It depends how much it melted.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not that you wouldn't see it, so it might not be all melted, but
Yeah, although I think like just looking at this, I would expect that this, the uncertainty of whatever that yield was would seem like it would touch zero.
yeah.
So no, I do agree that there does look like there might be a conflict there. I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that.
Yes, but I don't remember this very well, but this F0 particles like this sort of like for pi have A1 spectral color is something similar.
Well, so there's the A0 980, which is
from this
so the A0s are an isospin triplet. The F0 is very similar in mass, and I remember they actually like the A0 and the F0 mix with each other.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was your question, but sorry.
Well, this like don't remember very well. It's like you put this metal like ion, you have this A1, something like that.
Isn't the A1 the phi partner?
Yes.
Isn't that with the 5 you have
Which partner is this? Like this is a partner of the legend.
I thought the 5 turns into the A1, isn't that if you have chiral restoration?
Yeah,
the phi
chiral
is into the A1.
Yeah, they're distinguished by the parity, because phi is parity in C, because phi is minus minus, and I forget what, I think F and A are plus plus. I remember correctly.
So is it related to this spontaneous spirocentric rate? We have this ghost and boson coming up from the okay.
So yeah, that sounds right. I don't know the details of the physics of the F0 or the A0 that well.
Can you measure both the F0 and the A0?
Now I'm forgetting what the A0 decays into. Possibly, I would want to look at PDG before I give you an answer.
Yes.
It's very broad. It's very popular.
At least Alice and Stark typically haven't measured them, so there must be a reason why. But yeah, maybe it's also a combination of the width or what's decays into.
E0 decays into eta pi.
Okay, yeah, having data in there, I guess,
Yeah,
would
it's
make it a
kind of,
bit more difficult, yeah. I guess, yeah, if eta pi 0, then that would be challenging.
I don't know, just a general question about sorry, I was thinking about this just now, the sigmas. So for the sigma 0, when we measure lambdas, it's from the sigma 0 signal, right?
Yeah, there would be a large contribution from sigma 0, and Alice also has sigma 0 measurements just going to lambda photon, which I didn't include for time. But yeah, those are
Right,
also
okay.
another sigma that Alice can do.
Right.
But yeah, in principle, you'd need to account for that feed down as well.
Maybe if you have any additional questions, you can find Anders for the rest of the day, but we can end it there. So thanks again, Anders.